On a cool autumn evening in Washington, D.C., the city was bathed in the soft orange glow of streetlights. The air carried a slight chill, signaling the transition from summer to fall. James Carter, a man whose name had become synonymous with integrity and reform, sat behind the wheel of his car as he drove home after another grueling day at work. As the first African-American FBI director in decades, Carter had broken barriers and earned respect for his relentless pursuit of justice. However, his rise to prominence hadn't come without challenges. There were those who admired him deeply, seeing him as a beacon of hope and change, while others viewed him with suspicion or outright hostility. Carter's mind wandered as he navigated the quiet suburban streets. His thoughts were consumed by the meetings he'd attended earlier that day, discussions about corruption within law enforcement, strategies to combat organized crime, and plans to address systemic racism. These were weighty topics, ones that required not just intellect but also courage. Despite the long hours and mounting pressure, Carter felt a sense of purpose. He believed in what he was doing, even if it sometimes made him a target. As he turned onto a less busy road lined with modest homes and neatly trimmed hedges, Carter noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared, growing brighter as they closed the distance between them. At first he thought nothing of it. Perhaps it was just another driver heading home. But then came the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights. His heart sank slightly as he realized he was being pulled over. Pulling to the side of the road, Carter took a deep breath. He reminded himself to stay calm. Traffic stops weren't uncommon, and he assumed this would be a routine matter, a minor issue like a busted taillight or maybe speeding. After all, he was careful when driving, always adhering to the rules of the road. Once the car was safely parked, he rolled down his window and waited patiently for the officer to approach. The sound of footsteps crunching against gravel broke the silence. Two figures emerged from the patrol car, their movements deliberate and authoritative. Carter glanced up, expecting the usual formalities. Instead, what greeted him was far more alarming. Both officers had their guns drawn, pointed directly at him. Their faces were tense, their bodies rigid with apparent readiness for confrontation. It was an intimidating sight, one that sent a jolt of unease through Carter's chest. "Step out of the vehicle," one of the officers barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Carter raised his hand slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm complying," he said calmly, trying to project reassurance rather than fear. There must be some misunderstanding. Despite his efforts to remain composed, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. One of the officers demanded identification, leaning into the car with an aggressive stance. Carter reached carefully into his pocket, retrieving his wallet. With steady hands, he pulled out his FBI credentials, holding them up so the officers could see. "I'm Director James Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he explained, his tone measured yet firm. To his astonishment, the officers didn't seem impressed or convinced. One muttered something under his breath, words laced with disdain. The other accused Carter of impersonating a federal agent, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of his badge. The absurdity of the accusation hit Carter like a punch to the gut. How could they not recognize him? Hadn't his face been plastered across newspapers and television screens countless times? The tension escalated further when the officers ordered Carter out of the car. Still keeping his hands visible, he complied, stepping onto the curb. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some peered cautiously from behind curtains, while others stood on their porches, watching the surreal scene unfold. Carter felt exposed, vulnerable, not just because of the guns trained on him, but because of the blatant disregard for his authority and identity. What struck him most was the palpable hostility emanating from the officers. They spoke to him not as a respected public figure, but as someone unworthy of basic respect. Every command they issued dripped with contempt, every gesture designed to assert dominance. For a brief moment, Carter wondered if this was how countless others before him had felt during similar encounters, ordinary citizens whose lives were disrupted by prejudice and power dynamics. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Carter stood there, humiliated and bewildered. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, the head of one of the nation's most powerful law enforcement agencies, reduced to a suspect in the eyes of these men. Yet despite the injustice of it all, Carter refused to let anger consume him. He knew that losing his temper would only worsen the situation. So, he remained silent, letting his dignity serve as his shield. Little did he know, this incident would soon ignite a firestorm across the country. News outlets would pick up the story, turning it into a symbol of broader societal issues. People would debate whether this was an isolated act of discrimination or evidence of deeper flaws within the system. And for Carter, this moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would test his resolve, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately reshape his legacy. But for now, standing under the cold gaze of two armed officers, all he could do was wait and hope that reason would prevail. The air was thick with tension as James Carter stood on the side of the road, his hands raised in surrender. The two officers loomed over him, their guns still pointed at his chest. Their expressions were hard and unyielding, as if they had already decided who he was before even speaking to him. One officer stepped closer, his voice sharp and cutting like glass. "You think flashing some fake badge is going to get you out of this?" he sneered. The words hit Carter like a slap, leaving him momentarily speechless. "I'm not impersonating anyone," Carter replied, his tone calm but firm. He repeated himself slowly, enunciating every word so there could be no misunderstanding. "I am Director James Carter of the FBI. You can verify my credentials." His attempt to reason seemed to fall on deaf ears. Instead of easing the situation, it only seemed to inflame the officers further. The second officer muttered something under his breath, words that were barely audible but carried unmistakable venom. Though Carter couldn't make out exactly what was said, the tone alone told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about evidence or facts. It was about power and prejudice. Carter's mind raced. He had spent years building a reputation for fairness and integrity, earning respect from colleagues and citizens alike. Yet here he was, reduced to defending his very identity against accusations that bordered on absurd. It was surreal, almost dreamlike, but the cold reality of the moment kept snapping him back. The guns pointed at him weren't props, they were real, and so was the danger they represented. Every instinct screamed at him to stay composed, to avoid escalating the situation further. But inside, frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. "Putty, your hands behind your back," one of the officers barked suddenly, startling Carter. Without hesitation, he complied, knowing better than to resist. As the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, a wave of shame washed over him. Not because he felt guilty, he knew he had done nothing wrong, but because of how demeaning the act felt. Here he was, a man entrusted with leading one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world, being treated like a common criminal. The neighbors who had gathered began whispering among themselves. Some looked confused, unsure of what to believe. Others watched with wide eyes, clearly disturbed by the sight of an unarmed man being detained at gunpoint. A few pulled out their phones, capturing video footage of the scene. Little did they, or Carter, know that these recordings would soon spark a national conversation. For now, though, all eyes were fixed on the unfolding drama. As the officers led Carter to the back of their patrol car, one of them leaned in close, his face inches away. "We'll see how much your fancy badge helps you now," he growled. The remark stung, not because it was particularly clever or original, but because of its sheer pettiness. It was the kind of comment meant to diminish someone, to strip away their dignity. Carter clenched his jaw but said nothing. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Sitting in the cramped back seat of the patrol car, Carter tried to process what was happening. The irony wasn't lost on him. As FBI director, he had overseen investigations into cases of police misconduct and racial profiling. He had spoken publicly about the need for accountability and reform within law enforcement. And yet here he was, experiencing firsthand the very issues he had worked tirelessly to address. It was maddening, infuriating, and deeply personal. Time seemed to drag on endlessly. The officers didn't seem in any hurry to resolve the situation. They lingered near their car, occasionally glancing at Carter through the rear window. Meanwhile, the crowd of onlookers continued to grow. Some shouted questions at the officers, demanding to know why Carter was being detained. Others simply stared, their faces etched with disbelief. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, a mix of anger, confusion, and unease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers made a call. From snippets of the conversation, Carter gathered that they were attempting to verify his identity. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. If he really were an imposter, wouldn't someone have figured it out by now? But laughter felt too far out of reach. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help matters. When the call ended, the officer returned to the patrol car, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Carter allowed himself to hope that the ordeal was finally coming to an end. Surely, once they confirmed his identity, they would release him and offer an apology. Surely, logic would prevail. But as the minutes ticked by, and nothing changed, that hope began to fade. Whatever response the officer had received, it hadn't softened their stance. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. A sergeant and another patrol car pulled up to the scene. The new arrivals quickly took charge, speaking quietly with the original officers. Carter strained to hear what was being said, catching only fragments of the conversation. Words like protocol and chain of command floated through the air, offering little clarity. Still, the presence of additional personnel signaled progress, however slow it might be. After what felt like hours, the handcuffs were finally removed. Carter rubbed his wrists, wincing slightly at the lingering discomfort. One of the officers muttered a grudging apology, though it lacked sincerity. "We had to follow procedure," the sergeant explained, his tone clipped and defensive. Carter nodded silently, choosing not to argue. He knew better than to expect genuine remorse from people who viewed him as less than equal. As he climbed back into his own car, Carter felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief washed over him, yes, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of disillusionment. He had always believed in the system, even when it faltered. Now he wasn't so sure. The incident left him questioning whether true change was possible, or if the barriers he faced were insurmountable. Driving away from the scene, Carter glanced at the rearview mirror. The patrol cars were still parked along the curb, their lights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Neighbors lingered nearby, reluctant to return to their homes. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the unnatural silence. The night was far from over. For Carter, for the community, and for the nation, what had started as a routine, evening had spiraled into something far more significant, setting the stage for a reckoning that would ripple far beyond that quiet suburban street. By the time James Carter arrived home, the incident was already beginning to take on a life of its own. Unbeknownst to him, one of the neighbors who had witnessed the traffic stop had uploaded a video of the encounter to social media. The clip was shaky and poorly lit, but it captured enough to convey the gravity of what had happened. Within hours, it went viral, spreading like wildfire across platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. By morning, millions of people had seen it, and the story dominated headlines nationwide. The footage showed Carter standing beside his car, hands raised in surrender as two officers pointed their guns at him. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the aggression displayed by the officers. Viewers could hear snippets of the confrontation, the accusations, the muttered remarks, and Carter's quiet insistence that he was telling the truth. To many, the scene was shocking not just because of its intensity, but because of who was involved. This wasn't an ordinary citizen caught in a routine traffic stop. This was the FBI director, a man whose face was familiar to anyone who followed the news. As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., talk shows, radio programs, and online forums buzzed with reactions. Some viewers expressed outrage, calling the incident a blatant example of racial profiling and abuse of power. Others defended the officers, arguing that they were simply doing their jobs and couldn't be expected to recognize every high-ranking official. Debates erupted both online and offline, with opinions divided along predictable lines. For some, the video confirmed long-held suspicions about systemic racism within law enforcement. For others, it raised questions about whether the system itself was broken, or if isolated incidents like this one were being blown out of proportion. News outlets scrambled to cover the story from every angle. Cable networks ran panel discussions featuring legal experts, civil rights activists, and former law enforcement officials. Journalists interviewed residents of the neighborhood where the incident occurred, capturing a range of perspectives. One woman described feeling sickened by what she saw, while another admitted she initially thought Carter might have been lying about his identity. The diversity of responses reflected the complexity of the issue, highlighting how deeply ingrained biases shaped people's perceptions. Social media amplified the conversation, turning hashtags like Justice for Carter and systemic racism into trending topics. Supporters rallied around Carter, praising his composure during the ordeal and using the moment to highlight broader issues of inequality. Memes and infographics circulated widely, drawing attention to statistics about racial disparities in policing. Critics, meanwhile, accused Carter supporters of exaggerating the significance of the incident. They argued that singling out these officers for criticism was unfair, and that focusing on one event detracted from efforts to address larger problems. Politicians weighed in almost immediately, eager to align themselves with public sentiment, or at least appear to do so. Members of Congress issued statements condemning the officers' actions, calling for accountability and transparency. Lawmakers from both parties introduced resolutions urging a thorough investigation, though their motivations varied. Some genuinely believed the incident warranted scrutiny, while others saw an opportunity to score political points. At the same time, conservative commentators pushed back, framing the backlash as evidence of a cancel culture that refused to give law enforcement the benefit of the doubt. Amid the noise, Carter himself remained largely silent. He declined interviews and avoided making public statements, choosing instead to focus on processing the events privately. Friends and family members described him as shaken but resolute. His wife, Lisa, stood by his side, offering unwavering support. In quiet moments at home, the couple discussed the implications of the incident, not just for Carter personally, but for the movement he had dedicated his career to advancing. They knew the spotlight wouldn't fade anytime soon, and they braced themselves for whatever came next. Behind the scenes, the FBI launched its own internal review of the incident. Agents reviewed the video footage, analyzed witness statements, and examined the conduct of the officers involved. While the Bureau typically avoided commenting on ongoing investigations, sources close to the matter suggested that top officials were taking the situation seriously. Privately, some expressed concern that the incident could damage the agency's reputation, particularly given Carter's role as a symbol of reform. Others argued that addressing the issue head-on presented an opportunity to demonstrate accountability and reinforce the Bureau's commitment to justice. Meanwhile, the two officers at the center of the controversy found themselves under intense scrutiny. Their names were released to the public, prompting a wave of vitriol directed at them and their department. Anonymous threats poured in, forcing local authorities to provide security for the officers and their families. Both men were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, a move that drew mixed reactions. Some praised the decision as appropriate and necessary, while others accused the department of overreacting to appease public outrage. In the days that followed, protests sprang up in cities across the country. Activists organized rallies outside, police departments demanding accountability not just for the officers involved, but for all instances of misconduct. Marchers carried signs bearing slogans like "No Justice, No Peace," and "Reform Now." Speakers took to podiums, sharing personal stories of run-ins with law enforcement and calling for systemic change. The energy was palpable, a mix of anger, frustration, and hope. Yet amidst the calls for action, there was also division. Not everyone agreed on what should happen next. Some advocated for immediate firings and criminal charges against the officers, viewing anything less as unacceptable. Others urged patience, emphasizing the importance of allowing investigations to run their course. These differing viewpoints sometimes led to heated exchanges, underscoring the challenges of finding common ground on such emotionally charged issues. As the national conversation unfolded, the incident began to take on symbolic significance. It became more than just a single episode involving one man. It represented a broader struggle for equality and fairness. For many African Americans, Carter's experience resonated deeply, evoking memories of similar encounters they or their loved ones had endured. It served as a reminder that no amount of success or status could shield someone from discrimination. For others, the story highlighted the urgent need for reforms aimed at rebuilding trust between communities and law enforcement. Despite the chaos swirling around him, Carter remained focused on his responsibilities. He continued to attend meetings, review cases, and oversee operations within the FBI. Colleagues noted that he seemed determined not to let the incident distract him from his mission. Still, the weight of the situation was evident. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his usual confidence appeared tempered by weariness. Those closest to him worried about the toll the ordeal was taking on his mental health, urging him to prioritize self-care. As the week drew to a close, the momentum showed no signs of slowing. New details emerged daily, fueling fresh rounds of debate and analysis. Calls for justice grew louder, echoing through streets and airwaves alike. What had started as a quiet evening drive had become a catalyst for change, or perhaps, depending on how events unfolded, a painful reminder of how far society still had to go. For James Carter, the road ahead promised to be fraught with challenges, but also opportunities to shape the narrative and push for meaningful progress. Inside the sleek modern halls of FBI headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. The building, usually buzzing with purpose and efficiency, now felt heavy with unspoken concerns. News of the traffic stop involving James Carter had spread quickly, among agents and staff, igniting a mix of emotions: pride, anger, frustration, and even fear. For many within the Bureau, Carter wasn't just their director. He was a symbol of progress, someone who represented the possibility of change in an institution often criticized for its shortcomings. But now, that same man was at the center of a national firestorm, and the ripple effects were being felt throughout the organization. At first, there was an outpouring of support. Agents gathered in hallways and break rooms discussing the incident in hushed tones. Some shared stories of their own encounters with bias or discrimination, while others expressed admiration for Carter's composure during what must have been a humiliating ordeal. Morale among rank-and-file employees remained relatively high, buoyed by the belief that their director would weather this storm with dignity. Posters bearing messages like "Stand with Carter" began appearing on bulletin boards, small but meaningful gestures of solidarity. However, not everyone within the Bureau saw the situation so positively. In private meetings behind closed doors, senior officials exchanged uneasy glances. They understood the gravity of the moment, not just for Carter personally, but for the FBI as an institution. The agency prided itself on upholding justice and integrity, yet here it was embroiled in controversy over an act of apparent racism directed at its leader. Some worried that public trust in the Bureau could erode if the matter wasn't handled carefully. Others fretted about how the scandal might impact ongoing initiatives, particularly those aimed at improving community relations and addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. One afternoon, a group of top aides met in a conference room to discuss next steps. The tension was palpable as they debated whether Carter should issue a formal statement or remain silent. "He needs to address this," argued one advisor, slamming his hand lightly on the table for emphasis. "The longer we stay quiet, the more it looks like we're hiding something," another countered. "But speaking out too soon could make things worse. People are already emotional about this. If he says the wrong thing, it'll blow up in our faces." The conversation shifted to internal dynamics. Several senior agents admitted privately that morale had taken a hit, though opinions varied on why. Some believed the incident highlighted long-standing frustrations within the Bureau, frustrations about slow-moving reforms and resistance to change. Others feared that external criticism might lead to increased scrutiny of the FBI itself, potentially undermining its effectiveness. One veteran agent sighed heavily, saying, "We've worked so hard to rebuild trust after past scandals. Now this happens. It feels like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back." As the days passed, whispers of dissent grew louder. A few mid-level managers started questioning whether Carter could continue leading effectively under such intense pressure. They pointed to the mounting political backlash and media coverage as evidence that his position was becoming untenable. Privately, some suggested that stepping down might be the best course of action, not because Carter had done anything wrong, but because staying could harm the Bureau's reputation further. These murmurs of doubt, though subtle, added another layer of stress to an already strained environment. For Carter himself, navigating this internal turbulence proved challenging. He tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, attending briefings and reviewing case files as usual. Yet, he couldn't ignore the weight of expectations pressing down on him. Every decision he made felt magnified, every word he spoke scrutinized. Even routine interactions with colleagues carried an undertone of awkwardness, as if people weren't sure how to act around him anymore. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others offered overly enthusiastic praise, clearly trying to boost his spirits. Despite the challenges, Carter found pockets of encouragement. Younger agents, especially those from diverse backgrounds, looked to him as a role model. Many approached him directly, thanking him for his leadership and expressing hope that he wouldn't let this incident derail his mission. "You've inspired us to keep pushing for change," one young analyst told him earnestly during a chance encounter in the cafeteria. Carter nodded, managing a small smile despite the fatigue etched into his face. Moments like these reminded him why he had taken on this role in the first place, to pave the way for a better future. Still, the strain was undeniable. Late at night, when the building emptied and the hum of activity faded, Carter sat alone. In his office, staring at stacks of documents and glowing computer screens, he replayed the traffic stop in his mind, dissecting every detail, the officers' words, their body language, the expressions of the neighbors watching silently. Each memory brought fresh waves of frustration and sadness. How could this happen? Hadn't he dedicated his life to serving justice? And yet, here he was, grappling with the same biases he had vowed to combat. His closest allies noticed the toll the situation was taking. Lisa, his wife, urged him to take breaks and prioritize his well-being. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she reminded him gently one evening over dinner. Friends and mentors echoed her sentiments, cautioning against burnout. Even trusted advisors within the Bureau encouraged him to delegate tasks and lean on his team. But Carter struggled to step back. To him, retreating, even temporarily, felt like admitting defeat, and that was something he refused to do. Amidst the chaos, Carter also faced tough questions about accountability. While the investigation into the officers' conduct continued, some within the Bureau pushed for stronger measures. Agents submitted proposals for new training programs focused on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity, hoping to prevent similar incidents in the future. Others advocated for closer collaboration with community organizations, arguing that transparency and dialogue were key to rebuilding trust. Carter listened carefully to these suggestions, recognizing their value. Still, implementing meaningful change required time and resources, two things in short supply given the current climate. As the weeks dragged on, the tension inside FBI headquarters showed no signs of easing. Conversations once reserved for private meetings spilled into open forums, with agents debating everything from policy reforms to the broader implications of the incident. Some frustrated employees vented their grievances publicly, posting anonymous comments online or speaking to journalists off the record. Meanwhile, supporters rallied behind Carter, organizing events and campaigns to amplify his message of reform. The division within the Bureau mirrored the larger societal debate unfolding outside its walls. Through it all, Carter remained steadfast, determined to use the incident as a catalyst for progress rather than a reason to retreat. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with obstacles and sacrifices, But he also believed deeply in the power of resilience and in the importance of continuing to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. As he prepared for yet another day of meetings and decisions, Carter reminded himself of the words he had spoken countless times before. Change doesn't come easy. It demands patience, persistence, and courage. And though the journey ahead seemed daunting, he resolved to embody those principles, one step at a time. The fallout from the traffic stop involving James Carter reached far beyond the walls of the FBI headquarters, seeping into the highest levels of government. The White House, already grappling with a crowded agenda of pressing issues, found itself thrust into the middle of yet another controversy. President Eleanor Hayes, known for her cautious approach to sensitive matters, called an emergency meeting with key members of her administration to discuss how best to handle the situation. The stakes were high. This wasn't just about one man, it was about race, policing, and public trust in leadership. In the Oval Office, advisors and political strategists gathered around the large wooden table, their faces etched with concern. Some argued that the administration needed to take a firm stance, condemning the officers' actions outright and calling for swift accountability. Others urged caution, warning that appearing too aggressive could alienate law enforcement allies or fuel accusations of bias. The room buzzed with competing viewpoints, each side presenting arguments backed by data, anecdotes, and projections of potential outcomes. At the center of it all sat President Hayes, listening intently as she weighed the options. "It's not just about Director Carter," said Marcus Reed, the president's senior policy advisor, breaking the tense silence. "This is bigger than him. People see this as a referendum on our commitment to racial justice. If we don't act decisively, they'll think we're indifferent, or worse, complicit." His words hung heavy in the air, prompting nods of agreement from several attendees. Across the table, however, Defense Secretary Patricia Langley countered, "We can't jump the gun here. Investigations are underway, and rushing to judgment undermines due process. We need to let the system work." President Hayes leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled thoughtfully. She understood both perspectives, but knew that finding a balance would be tricky. Public opinion was shifting rapidly, fueled by relentless media coverage and impassioned debates on social platforms. Polls showed growing dissatisfaction with law enforcement practices, particularly among minority communities. Yet there was also pushback from groups defending police officers, arguing that criticisms were unfair and demoralizing. Navigating this divide required finesse, and perhaps a willingness to make unpopular decisions. As the discussion unfolded, attention turned to Carter himself. Several advisors expressed concern about his ability to continue serving effectively as FBI director amid such intense scrutiny. "He's become a lightning rod," said Claudia Mendez, the White House press secretary. "Every move he makes will be dissected, every word analyzed. That kind of pressure isn't sustainable, not for him and not for the Bureau." Her remarks sparked a flurry of responses, with some agreeing that stepping aside might be the best option while others vehemently disagreed. Vice President Daniel Kim spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "James Carter is more than just a director. He's a symbol of hope for millions of Americans who believe in the possibility of change. Asking him to step down sends the wrong message, that standing up against injustice comes at too great a cost." The room fell silent as his words sank. And for many, Carter's presence represented progress, a tangible sign that barriers could be broken and systems reformed. Losing him now would feel like a betrayal of those ideals. Yet behind closed doors, influential figures began quietly lobbying for Carter's resignation. Among them were powerful lawmakers, lobbyists, and even some within the president's inner circle who feared the incident had become a liability. They argued that keeping Carter in his position risked alienating moderate voters and complicating legislative priorities. One senator confided to a colleague, "I admire what he stands for, but politics is about pragmatism. Sometimes you have to cut your losses." For President Hayes, these conversations added another layer of complexity. On one hand, she respected Carter deeply, valuing his expertise and dedication to reform. On the other hand, She couldn't ignore the mounting pressure from allies and opponents alike. Late at night, after the meetings ended and the lights dimmed in the West Wing, she often sat alone in her private study, reviewing notes and reflecting on the choices before her. Should she stand firmly behind Carter, risking backlash? Or should she prioritize stability, even if it meant sacrificing a trusted ally? Meanwhile, Congress jumped into action, introducing resolutions and holding hearings to address the broader implications of the incident. Lawmakers grilled experts on topics ranging from police training to systemic racism, using the spotlight to advance their agendas. Some pushed for sweeping reforms, proposing legislation aimed at increasing accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Others focused on narrower measures, such as funding body cameras or improving community outreach programs. Debates grew heated, with tempers flaring and alliances shifting unpredictably. Public protests continued to swell, drawing thousands of demonstrators to streets across the country. Chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through city squares, while banners bearing Carter's image served as rallying points for activists demanding change. In Washington, D.C., a massive march culminated outside the Department of Justice, where speakers called for immediate action. "This isn't just about one man being treated unfairly," declared civil rights leader Maya Thompson during a fiery speech. "It's about dismantling the structures that allow injustice to thrive." Despite the chaos, Carter remained largely absent from the public eye, choosing instead to focus on his duties within the FBI. He declined invitations to testify before Congress or appear on major news networks, explaining privately that he didn't want to politicize the incident further. This decision drew mixed reactions. Supporters praised his restraint, seeing it as a sign of maturity and wisdom. Critics accused him of shirking responsibility, suggesting that his silence allowed others to shape the narrative without his input. Back at the White House, President Hayes wrestled with the final pieces of the puzzle. After days of deliberation, she decided to issue a carefully worded statement, acknowledging the seriousness of the incident while reaffirming her administration's commitment to addressing systemic issues. "What happened to Director Carter is unacceptable," she declared during a televised address. "But we must channel our outrage into meaningful action. Together, we can build a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." Her words offered temporary relief, calming some critics while frustrating others who felt the response lacked teeth. Meanwhile, Carter received a private call from the president, during which she reiterated her support, but also hinted at the possibility of exploring other opportunities in the near future. It was a subtle nudge, one that left Carter feeling conflicted. He appreciated the gesture but couldn't shake the sense that external forces were beginning to dictate his fate. As the days stretched into weeks, the pressure mounted. Allies encouraged Carter to consider stepping down voluntarily, framing it as a noble sacrifice for the greater good. Opponents seized on any misstep, amplifying doubts about his leadership. Through it all, Carter clung to his principles, refusing to let fear or fatigue dictate his decisions. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also believed that true progress rarely came without sacrifice. And so, as the nation watched and waited, the question lingered. Would James Carter weather the storm? Or would the weight of expectation prove too much to bear? Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain. The incident had ignited a conversation that wouldn't fade anytime soon. For better or worse, the legacy of that quiet autumn evening would continue to shape the course of history.